Do you believe in us? I think we'll figure it out. Hey, come with me, I'll show you the way out. This is the way out.
All right, here we are, episode 100. Welcome to Blackbird. My name is James, and today it's bittersweet. So this is going to be my last episode, at least for a while, probably for at least the rest of 2022, and we'll see what happens after that. So we're just going to have a chat with some of my friends today. I don't really like to have topics too much if I'm interviewing people who I'm familiar with. So we'll probably just touch on everything. So I don't really have any announcements. I mean, this is going to be it for a while. So I guess if you're just hurting for Blackbird content, then check the YouTube channel. I'll be uploading the audio of the last few episodes in the next couple of weeks. And then after that, check out the other guys' podcasts. So I have never had Justin Campbell on the show before, and I thought that I had. He was supposed to be here last week, and then other things happened. So he's here this week, and I'm going to introduce him first because he's here first. Justin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, James.
Yeah, sure thing. I'm going to let you do like a full intro after I bring in the other two. So LB and Matt, my two favorite guests. Actually, maybe my third most popular episode outside of Jack from the Perfume Nationalist. For some reason that those episodes draw a huge listenership. So if you guys are looking to expand your brands, you might want to invite him on. And I think somebody big like that, or Tom Woods or somebody like that. So Justin, since you're the noob here, why don't you introduce yourself and tell everybody what you do?
So I'm Justin Campbell. I do the Fact Check This podcast, as well as a morning show called The Morning After. And I've also been, for the last couple years, doing a whole bunch of audio, video, and production work for, at any given time, a dozen different podcasts. Some that you would probably know, like Lines of Liberty, Counterflow with Buck Johnson, and then some other smaller ones that you might not know that you should, like The Paradox, Always Andy's Mom, and Civil Discord. So,
is The Paradox the one that's hosted by two doctors, or is that two different Paradox
it's
podcasts?
So it's Eric Larson is the host of that, and then he does interviews with other doctors or medical professionals, people in the industry, and
Nice.
he has some really good content on that. If you want to get a look at the medical industry and some of the things that are kind of wrong with it, and also some of the things that medical professionals are trying to do to fix those problems, it's a really good resource to check out.
Yeah, I've listened to it a couple of times. It's a pretty good show. LB, you're in the bottom left, so you go next.
Hi.
Hi.
Happy to be here.
It's been a little bit, huh?
Yeah, nice to see everybody. Congrats on making it to 100.
Thank you.
BeenAwake.com. If you guys don't know already, now you know. Go to BeenAwake.com. Subscribe with your email. I'll say that a few more times around some more interesting thoughts, I hope.
Hopefully. And then Matt, finally.
I'm Matt. I am King Pilled is my show, and it's been kind of on hiatus. I didn't necessarily intend for it to go on hiatus, but it kind of worked out that way when we relocated to Texas, and we're working on getting started on a new career and a new life and a new church and basically new everything. It kind of got backseated a little bit, but it's starting to come back around, and I'm getting to a point here where I guess I went through a stretch of time where I just didn't have anything to talk about, and now I'm starting to feel like I got things to talk about again. Especially thanks to people like Justin or LB. We've recently had some really interesting conversations, So yeah, so you can look up King Pilled. It's on any podcatcher or on YouTube, and you can follow me on Twitter at Real King Pilled. That's where you'll see me the most.
There we
The
go.
man who dared say, "Don't be poor."
Well, and see, as James is going on hiatus, Kingfield can come back off a hiatus, and you can
Yeah,
just fill your
exactly.
content needs with that for a while.
Yeah, there you go.
Just be forewarned, King Pilled is way longer than Blackbird, and also whether or not it's going to get uploaded to an audio platform for podcast consumption is even less sure than Blackbird.
Yeah.
So just remember that, audio listeners. Matt, you are to blame for my hiatus. Actually, you last time you were here, you didn't say don't be poor, but you did say liberty is not something you ask for, it's something you create. And that led to Liberty Creators, which is sort of this on again, off again project that I'm starting. LB, I think you and I actually had some discussions about that as well. I decided that I'm going to make it a solo thing rather than a joint thing. Sorry. But that's going to be my next project. So I'm, and the other thing, and Matt, I guess maybe you can relate to this, is I just don't really feel like I'm interested in interesting things right now. Or at least the interesting things that I'm interested in, I'm not able to talk about them yet. Like I'm still learning. But
Yeah.
really, I mean, really what it is that I'm not interested in interesting things. I'm I think last time y'all were here, I actually, I think, Matt, I even like asked you for permission to stay part of like the Mises Caucus and the LP milieu. And you said it's fine, just do it as a hobby. So thank you for that. But
You're welcome.
That's been my main focus for the last several months. And as you know, as much fun as I have with my friends in the LP, it's not interesting. So it's been tough to not turn this into a libertarian podcast, which I emphatically did not want it to be at the beginning. So even like Thad Russell, when I forget whose show he was on, but he called it his favorite libertarian podcast. I'm like, okay, well that's great. I'm glad that there's people who like it, but I don't want it to be a libertarian podcast. So
I went in the other direction. I started mine with the intent of being a libertarian podcast, and then got bored talking about that stuff and decided I'll talk about some current events type stuff. But for the most part, I want to talk about things that I think are interesting and amusing, historical things, or just like today I did a live stream this morning talking about books and comics and video games being turned into movies and TV shows, and when they don't follow canon and they kind of do things different from the source material. Like, how do you feel about that? We spent an hour talking about comic books and video games and literature and stuff, and the different adaptations of that. I kind of moved away from the libertarian stuff into wanting to do other stuff that actually interests me, and whether other people want to listen to it or not is entirely up to them. But that's not why I'm doing it.
Well, and I think all four of us though have sort of re-entered the political sphere. LB, you kind of never left the political sphere, I guess. You've always talked about culture and politics and stuff like that. But Matt, I mean, as sort of Jason Stapleton's right-hand man for a long time, your focus was not so much politics or even culture. I mean, it was more getting ahead for yourself. That's kind of what your King Pilled original message was, I think, was sort of being the king of your own castle. Is that right? Or is it?
Yeah, that's basically it. And to me, I kind of saw it as sort of at the intersection of all of those subjects. It was at the intersection of business and culture and politics and religion, and I spent the first year of the show. It's crazy. That's the Stop Being Poor incident where I simultaneously offended every person on Liberty Twitter. That was just over a year ago. That was like 13 or 14 months ago, which it feels like it was 5 years ago. So much has changed in the last year. But the show was, we kind of just started doing it because I had stuff on my mind that I wanted to say. And Steven, my co-host, was like, you need to say this stuff publicly. And I was like, all right, well, other people are saying you need to say stuff publicly. So I was like, all right, I'll just start saying stuff publicly. I don't know what we're going to talk about, but we'll just go live and start talking. And that's kind of how it turned out. And I was trying to find my way. I was kind of trying to find my message. And to a degree, I think I still I still kind of am, but it's gotten a lot clearer to me over the last year. But trying to find where does politics end and religion begin? Where does culture end and business begin? Where does business end and politics begin? Like where do these how do you actually separate these things? Because we think of them as separate, but they're all interdependent. And you kind of can't go. I mean, I thought that I was fully in the realm of science and like at the cutting edge of physics and quantum mechanics and stuff. Like this is what was sort of my hobby that I was watching. I'd go on endless YouTube binges and stuff, watching this stuff. And next thing I knew, I was at Eastern mysticism. And next thing I knew, I was at Eastern Christianity. And I was like, how did I get from here to here? And I realized that a lot of these things are, you see the difference if you're really up close to them, but you zoom out far enough and you start seeing where all of these things all begin to intersect. And I think I hate using this word because I feel like it's like everyone kind of wants to be this, but there's the term polymath, and it's like, it's kind of a lost thing today. There aren't really a lot of polymaths anymore, but it's like a person who's like a legitimate genius and expert in a whole variety of fields. And this used to be kind of, I mean, a polymath is sort of a relative term, I think, given relative to the age. Different ages have different standards for what constitutes a polymath. And I'd say the standard today is pretty low. But I think that for great men, if you have an aspiration to be a great man, I think that a prerequisite is to have polymathic instincts, at least. And from there, kind of the king-pilled idea sort of was born out of that you've got to start by being, if you're concerned about the condition of the political culture, then, or the culture, if you want to do something about it, you need to be someone who can influence it and actually influence it, not just complain about it, which means you need to be successful in business, which means you need to have an understanding of the culture. You need to be able to actually connect and interface with the culture in an influential way, which means that you need to have an understanding of the spiritual world and the material world and the way in which they interface. So I found myself kind of just dipping into all these different spheres and trying to figure out where they connect and where they intersect. And I kind of got a little overwhelmed with it, I think. And that's why I, with stuff going on in my life and everything, I sort of backed out of it altogether for a little while. But in backing away from it, a lot of it kind of coalesced in my head, and I feel like I have a much clearer kind of a vision or path forward now than I did, say, a year or 8 months ago.
Well, that's good. That's promising for me because I feel like I'm there. I've come to the conclusion, or I hate to say conclusion because like I never reach conclusions, and that's one thing that is maybe good or bad about me, depending on how you feel about conclusions. But like the reason that I don't call myself an agorist, and the reason that integral theory, which was something that I explored, at the very sort of front end of my podcasting career, and just a lot of these different things, the reason that I'm not ascribing to them is that they're all kind of eschatological, and they feel like we need to reach this end state in order to have reached our goal. And like I guess I just don't see ideology and even like history as reaching a goal. Actually, y'all talked about this. I don't know, LB, this might have been just you off the cuff, or it may have been when you were talking to Matt. I don't remember. You said something like progressivism is the socialism that won the 20th century or something like that. Is that about right?
Yep.
First of all, how did you come to that conclusion? Where did that come from?
A lot of the wellspring for that is the book Illiberal Reformers by Thomas Leonard, where he just points out the connections between early progressives and Germanic historianism, which was a precursor itself to socialist thought. And then it's also an effort in storytelling and sense making. So I'm trying to take complex ideas and put them in a way that I think people can map their understanding of things onto. So if we look at the big umbrella of socialism of the 20th century, you can see National Socialism in the fascist movements, which was a reaction to international socialism, which were the communists. And then the idea that I kind of had was like, well, then across the pond, right? Because we're really talking about Europe for these ideas, and then America, and then across the pond, we kind of had this fusion that was eventually called progressivism, and the idea was based around the concept of, well, we can't do this all at once. We have to go little by little. And I think and then also you can one characteristic of progressivism is that it was far more amenable to corporate interests, right? And in fact, it is a lot to do with like the modern corporate state that we, or modern corporations, and the increasingly corporate state that we deal with today. And I think it has a lot. I think that has a lot to do with it. It was also not as ideological in that it didn't rely on. It was like it was okay with capitalism as long as capitalism was as long as the right people were in charge of it. So it's a good book. I'd highly encourage people to read it if they're interested in the time period. It also really lays out the race and eugenics or race and eugenic origins tied with the progressive movement. And the concept and the paternalism, the social gospel, the connections to the social gospel, a lot of it came from that book. And then other historical tidbits I picked up along the way, listening to people who are far more researched than I, talking about it.
I think progressivism also is of the three different. I'm thinking like Marxist socialism, fascist socialism, and progressivism socialism are kind of the three main branches that competed against one another in the early 20th century. Of those three, progressivism is also, ironically, I guess, the one that isn't progressing towards some end state. There's no like progressive eschatology. Make the world safe for democracy. What exactly does that mean?
Right. Well, but part of that has to do with the pragmatism, which was also in vogue at the beginning of the 20th century. So it's like, okay, we're going to set aside this outlandish idea that there's a natural progression to history and that we're all going to end up in an anarchist communist utopia, right? Because that's what the strict Marxist believed. It was like, okay, yeah, but this seems to work, right? If we had put experts in charge of the economy, that's going to work. So we're going to do that. So it had a far more pragmatic element to it as well, that I think again created the behemoth that we kind of that we deal with today.
And it unlike Marxism and unlike fascism, it not only allows for but almost demands high time preference in order to work. The those other kind of ideologies like Christianity, or I guess traditionalism or conservatism or something like that. Those things, those ideologies and religions and so forth, they demand low time preference. They demand some sort of discipline in order to reach the eschatological end time, or your personal eschatology, your personal judgment before Christ, or your personal your collective ascent into the utopia, whatever it is.
Well, just to add on a little bit to what I was saying, what I've kind of added to that understanding, because I've managed to build that, and okay, that gets us to like the end of the 19th into the 20th and 21st century. Listening to different people like Matt and Andrew and others is becoming more aware of this space that actually let's look at socialism as a derivation of liberalism, which it clearly is because it comes from it. And so you actually then look at the entire set of liberalism as something that can be critiqued as well. And I think that's where things have gotten really interesting, insofar as I have been recalibrating the means by which I interpret the world, because it's because as I say all the time, this core is skepticism, which is basically just questioning and making sure that you're looking at your prior assumptions to things. But the last few years have required a lot of recalibration, and doing the show has given me the opportunity to kind of present that in real time. And you can kind of see, and it traces to these larger things of materialism versus mysticism. There's different stories we can tell, but I think, I think certainly one thing that I hope people would agree on is that we've kind of reached a point where we have to look for newer answers, or reinterpreting things for an age that hasn't quite set in yet. And that's where things get esoteric, and that's why people look at people like, I don't know, the guys assembled here funny, or they don't quite understand, because literally it's it's an attempt to reestablish the boundaries of what politics is, and what in politics is, for whatever else you might say, has been integral to human society, right? And if we say politics is the application of power or whatever, it has some relation to that. Clearly that's endemic in the species, given that we're hierarchical. So it's been an interesting ride. And so, yeah, and trying to make sense of it is the fun part for me.
So are you guys still calling yourself libertarian?
No.
Like if some random person, not me, if some random person asked you like, hey, what's your political stances, would you tell them I basically lean libertarian, or would you say something else?
I would say something else.
I tend to just try and stay away from that in my daily life as much as possible. Which has had tremendous improvements on my relationships and things like that. I certainly let people. I don't really. I'm less concerned about what people call me and more concerned about whether they're listening to me. So if somebody calls me a libertarian, great. If somebody calls me a super conservative, great. My thing is that they think I'm somebody who should. What I try to demonstrate, through when I do talk about things, and the people that I choose to share that with, or people who listen to my show, is demonstrating that I have the capacity to talk about ideas in a way that makes sense. Whether that comes across, and to whatever ideological spin I put on it is separate from that. So personally, though, I find myself farther and farther away from the label than I would have thought at the beginning of my project at BeenAwake.com, because it was a set of ideas that I had held close allegiance to for a number of years, and frankly still hold close allegiance to many of the policy prescriptions and tactics and things of that nature. It's just everyone else has decided that you can't call yourself a libertarian unless you're in the LP now. So that's kind of where we are. Truthfully, if I'm going to be glib, that's what I would say.
Where do you get that?
The fact that everybody calls us post-libertarians is that just for there's different elements to that, okay, but there's the theology is one aspect, but yeah, I would just start there. It's my perception. I'm not saying it's accurate. It's but certainly when people point and say, oh, this is a libertarian opinion, I react differently to that than I would, and it depends on the person, of course.
Yeah,
What about you, Justin?
I'll either say libertarian-ish or little L libertarian. There are things that I like about it, and there are things that I disagree with, and I try to craft my own personal life around doing things that are going to be beneficial to freedom and liberty for me and my family in our lives and what we have in our community, and a little less about the actual party politics type stuff.
Yeah, I think last time we talked, you were kind of transitioning from LP libertarian to libertarian-ish, which actually LB, if you recall, that was
something we talked about. Yeah,
that was what I called myself the very first time I was ever on your show.
Yes, sir.
I think I've gone the other direction and am now comfortable calling myself libertarian. And even if I weren't in the party, which like I said, I've realigned myself with the party, I probably still would be okay with that term. Although, yeah, I
see, I'm still in the Libertarian Party, but it's a personal choice because I know the state chair for Indiana really well, and I respect and appreciate what he is doing in the state. So because of that relationship, I'm a state party member, and I let him con me into doing they call it a 3-in-1 or something. You join the state party, national, and they send you money for your county affiliate. So I do that but it's entirely relationship based. It's because I know Evan and because I respect and appreciate what he's doing, and I have actually seen them have positive influence on the politics of this state to make things happen and to help kind of shift bad Republicans in a good direction to help see liberty and freedom in that actually impacts us. Like we've got constitutional carry now and all kinds of other stuff that because they're able to push the envelope. So that's why I say libertarian-ish, because I'm still technically a libertarian, but I don't necessarily have any use for a national party on that type of a thing.
Matt Cooper in the chat says that you went down the alt-right pipeline hard and fast, and then y'all started talking about penises, so I didn't pay attention because no.
Those two things are part and parcel.
are you alt-right? What would you call yourself? You said you would say something else, but you didn't really elaborate.
I typically say that I typically say Christian, right wing, and maybe if the conversation calls for it, I might say monarchist. But it's by and large, I don't really care about politics on the individual level anymore. So I don't really care what individual people think of my politics, because I don't think my individual politics impacts very much.
Yeah, totally.
I've go ahead.
Well, elaborate on politics on the individual level. What does that mean, and what does it contrast with?
Politics. I'm laughing at the chat. Politics is necessarily a I was going to say collective, but that's a buzzword. It's necessarily a tribal pursuit. It doesn't. The idea of politics and individuals makes no sense at all. It just doesn't. Individuals don't exist in politics. The entire concept of politics implies that you have groups of people who are not acting as individuals. That you have groups of people who are acting as groups of people. And then I've also become convinced that at least 80, probably 90% of the population, their political opinions or inclinations are absolutely meaningless because they've basically been implanted in their minds.
Right. It's just a reflection.
Right.
That's because under democracy, the idea is that you have your own politics. Well, these are my political prescriptions, and it's something that everybody who's listening to this and who participates in political podcasting, we all come from that vein, and so it's very much. And so when you kind of get to, I think when you reach the post-liberal state, is when you start to say, well, what I want isn't really the point of politics. Mm-hmm. And specifically if we want to study this, we have to I think we have to completely remove what I want, quote unquote, from that calculation. And I think that's when you start to see, that's when you can start to see the mover, the force behind the movement, right? And that's where you start to see, I think, the incentive structure for what it is. So yeah, I think there's an element of that too. And I think, I don't know, like it's like, oh, so and so we got into a conversation about politics, and it's funny how I've worked so hard to make sure that doesn't happen unless I know the person is already sympathetic in one way or another.
Yeah.
And that's,
I don't want to talk about politics with normies.
It's difficult to, right? And
right.
It's one of those, and so that's where when you're in that, it's like, well, what would you call yourself? By the time somebody's asking,
you're not having a conversation with that person. You're having a conversation with an amalgamation of media sources that have implanted opinions in that person's mind that they're just regurgitating. So you've got to wade through all the regurgitated opinions until you actually get to the person themselves. Yep. And this sounds incredibly arrogant, but right. And once you actually get to the person, if you actually get to that point, then there's nothing there. There's nothing to actually have a conversation with, because if you've gone through, if they're not part of the smaller fraction of the population that is original thinkers, another kind of stupid buzzword, but like the people that are like capable of generating their own opinions or thinking critically or evaluating outside the box, off the 3x5 card of allowable opinion, which interestingly, libertarianism is squarely in the middle of the 3x5 card of allowable opinion. If you get outside of that, the majority of people are not going to actually engage in a conversation with you, because they're not going to. It's like there's nothing there a conversation implies like two people dialoguing back and forth, and they're not bringing anything to the table to actually dialogue about.
And it also changes.
I'm not interested in talking to those people.
It's also a matter of how you change the nature of that conversation too. So in my instances, like I will talk to people, but I try really hard to make sure it's understood. Like, listen, if we're gonna get into this, like I need affirmative consent. Like I need you to understand. I need
Make
you
them
to
sign a little
understand.
contract.
I've actually done that before, and it's because it's a boundaries thing for me.
It's
But
like you've got to
also
say yes at each step of the process. Like, all right,
Kind-
can I unbutton your pants now? Yes. Okay. Can I?
can I introduce you to this concept that I've been putting forth? But in all seriousness, but like I kind of pointed out to before, it's also recognizing, and this is the thing that I've worked on. It's also recognizing the fact that most people still are going to interact with what I broadly refer to as the cult of American democracy, where it's the liberals and the conservatives are fighting each other for the betterment of government, and and the liberals are the good guys and the conservatives are the bad guys, right? And it is literally a kayfabe thing in that regard. And that is the modality that most people operate on when they interact with politics. So when because you asked like, what do I call myself? It's less about what I call myself and how I analyze things as they're brought up. And then when people like that analysis, then that's when it's whatever the word that we're gonna settle on will come to be at that point. But I think that's an important thing of like, if you want to engage with people, you actually have to do it on their terms, because that's the only way that they can understand it. And that's one thing I think I do well, is talking between multiple modalities and trying to express the same idea set.
Justin, you were going to say something earlier. Do you remember what it was?
Yeah. So, like what I was going to say was in relation to talking to other people, and what Matt was talking about. Like, once you do start to actually like chip away at some of the maybe bad information or the corporately approved narrative that a lot of people on either the right or the left, like regardless of which side you're talking to, there are always pre-programmed responses that seem to come up. And it always feels like once you've kind of dug through and you hit like bedrock, you just find like this hollow core. There's nothing there. They don't actually have any true held opinions or knowledge even. And it's kind of disheartening. I've got a bunch of kids, and I try to fill their heads with all kinds of crazy shit on a daily basis, just because I want them to be engaged and thinking and questioning. And I would like it if they questioned me a little bit less from time to time, but like I want them to question everything else all the time. And so like, but that's also the way I was raised. I had my dad was into conspiracy theories and stuff like that, and he kind of pushed us on that sort of stuff. So like, it's disheartening to have a conversation with somebody, and then when you finally get down to what they believe, there's nothing there. Like if you strip away everything that they've been told, they don't have anything else there. It's and I don't. How do you like? How do we address that in society? I think is what I really want to like get after is how do you fill these people with something? Because right now there is nothing. There is whatever has been dumped into them by social media and the approved press.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I probably would rephrase it as more like, how do you replace what's there with what we want to be there? Because
Sure.
they're filled with stuff. Like it's not that they're an empty void and we can just pour our ideas into their heads. They've already got ideas that have been poured into their heads. That's kind of like, I'm wearing my NPC t-shirt from Top Lobster, toplobster.com. That's what NPCs do. Like they just run their programs. How do you reprogram them? Do you guys have ideas on that at all? Or is it important to reprogram them?
Seize
There's a
the
really
means
good
of
video.
information.
Yeah. Speaking of the NPC, just a sidebar, there's a really good video on the NPC from a spiritual perspective by a guy named David Patrick Harry. His YouTube channel is called Church of the Eternal Logos. He was just on Bucks on Counterflow.
That's okay. I knew I had heard
Yeah.
from him, and it wasn't on King Pilled, so I was wondering where that was. All right, sweet.
He did his own live stream on it where he talked about the NPC being like this is an actual spiritual phenomenon, being an NPC, and he compared it to the Orthodox concept of theosis, and the NPC is like inverse theosis. It's it's humans becoming animals, humans like going in the opposite direction and becoming more and more animal as they're all becoming the same thing. They're all like moving toward this stasis that is, they're losing their humanness. They're losing what makes them distinct as humans, and becoming programmed NPCs. And like Cooper says in the chat here, give them a religion and a king. Like that would be for me, that would be the short answer. Because this question that you're asking, how do we take what they've been programmed with and program them with something different, essentially? That's a spiritual question. It's not just a political question. It's not just a cultural question. It's a spiritual question. How are people psychologically programmed? And you can't get into that conversation without going spiritual. You can't without going into essentially a spiritual realm. You're talking about religions at this point, and what the majority of people, the vast majority of the normies, the types of people we're talking about, have been programmed by the American civic religion, which is basically the last year of King Pilled was kind of trying to unpack this idea as it being a kind of a derivation, a secularized derivation of Protestantism, but ultimately people are wired to crave a king. They're wired to follow their leaders. They're wired to follow. You can call them elites. You can call them experts. You can call them whatever you want, but people are wired to follow them, and they will follow them.
Well, and so then it really matters what character and form those leaders take,
right?
Which is where we're kind of okay. So that's the simple answer. Let's try a more complicated a way of answering the question, which is, I think there is. I've remarked that millennials in particular, with this new technology of the internet, we have constantly been identifying ourselves to, formless cyberspace our entire lives, right? Like what started as ASL is now like graduated to where, to like an emoji flag, and that can represent an entire set of ideas, let's say. But I think it has less. I think when you're talking about when you get to the bottom and there's nothing there, I think in one respect, it's kind of understandable because most people aren't going to have a deep understanding of politics, right? So then it's just a matter
and they shouldn't.
And they shouldn't. I'm not saying it's a good idea that they do. But then when you're moving to the deeper levels and where you're getting into more of the NPC phenomena, as it were, is you run into this thing where I think at some point I have to finish listening to the Church of the Logos breakdown of the NPC because it jars a little bit with my own. But one thing that is clear is that there are a number of people who are willing to just take the marching orders and run with them. And so then again, that's why I said, we can complicate this stuff and talk about how, well, maybe the fact that capitalism stopped working the way it was supposed to because they've been inflating our currency and running up the debt book for the past 100 years. And so this is the generation that has to deal with that consequence, because for a long time, everything just getting marginally better was enough. Right. And you can and because the times were good, you didn't think about the long term or you didn't think about the spiritual ramifications of your existence, let's say. Now that at higher and at wider and wider circles, right, different levels of complexity in society, we're dealing with this idea of like, oh, things aren't getting better. In fact, things are getting worse. I think that's where you start to see this crisis of identity, and you look deep inside yourself and you say, okay, what are the things that I have been given in my life that actually have intrinsic meaning beyond the material? And unfortunately for a lot of people, they look inside and they find out that they don't have anything, and then that's a really scary place to be, right? It's so scary that you're gonna do everything you can in your power as an individual to remove that thought from your mind, up to and including calling, up to including like cutting off relations with a family member because you argue about something as mundane as American politics. Right. Does that make sense? So there isn't a simple answer. There never has been a simple answer, but the realization that at the center of our society has been unmoored, that the moral bedrock has been bifurcated, I think are the two key insights people need to start incorporating into how they process and calculate the world. And that has a manifestation in your business life, but also but more importantly in your political life, in that it exists.
I think one thing that I haven't lost interest in, and this is probably because, again, it doesn't have an end state, is the kind of cycles and oscillations of history. Matt, you touched earlier, and I think this has probably been the common theme of the last few minutes, is that people are craving spirituality. People, I mean, okay, fine. On one level, I think people have always craved spirituality, but well, okay, here's a for instance. Like, I noticed, LB, that the guy that you interviewed earlier, God, I forgot his name. Anyway, he's turning some scientific topic, like comparing some scientific topic to politics. Matt, you said that this guy makes the best analogies you've ever heard. If that helps jog your memory as to who I'm talking about.
That I interviewed?
Yep, you interviewed him on your show like maybe 2 episodes ago, or fairly recently, anyway. And you guys brought him up in your recent conversation as well. It doesn't really matter. So there's that. There's LB. You were talking last time you were on my show about how you want to turn Euclidean geometry into politics or vice versa.
Sure. Yep.
Andrew, when he developed archotropism, he compared it to fluid dynamics. All of these scientific topics are being equated with politics, and politics being sort of a stand-in for spirituality and religion. It's sort of a metaphysical thing. I'm wondering why it is you guys think that so many of these natural sciences, and I guess if math is not a natural science, then lump that in there as well, are being kind of shoehorned in, I guess, maybe into the political discussion, at least in our circles. If you've noticed that, and if you haven't, then just
I think
anyway.
The reason why I do it is because I'm trying to bolster my argument. So I look for something, like I've talked about the idea of trying to map ideas geometrically in a theoretical way, and it's less about whether that's exactly the case and more about whether that can be used to help somebody coalesce really, really complicated ideas. And because I think ideas can operate on multiple levels simultaneously, and the best kinds of ideas are the ones that can do that. So vis-a-vis, what do I do with my life? Well, love God with all your heart. Don't steal, don't hurt people, don't blah 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 blah. Right? Those are your basic prescriptions. It's like, well, what if I have questions about that? It says, okay, here's a million other pages you can read talking about why you should do this. So you have as little or as much as you want. I think people use. Here's a tangent, but I was thinking recently about the problem of the completely bifurcated moral frame that the American left and the American right operate under at the current moment. And I was thinking about how where we've created quote unquote universal knowledge are in these fields of physics, are in these fields where of chemistry and and thermodynamics and and geometry and mathematics. So that's as close to like universal quote unquote truth as we can get to, but it's all very cold, and it's all and interestingly enough, while it has complexity, it's also about the most simple representation of something. Like I was thinking about the fact that chemistry is super interesting, but it's also like what's really interesting about a hydrogen atom? Well, there's nothing interesting about a hydrogen atom. What's interesting is what you can do with a hydrogen atom, or what a hydrogen atom can accomplish, or what oxygen is, and what that provides. And so I think when we start with something that is generally regarded as a scientific truism, let's use that word, it's a means by which we're trying to establish a frame on which more than just myself can agree with this. And so that's a very logical way that we can try to build a case. Another way of doing this would be using religious arguments as well, right? And this is the role of dogma. So if you say that fine, apparently all elements are fake. But if you have next.
Cooper in the YouTube chat has just completely derailed our conversation. Just fucking, you're the best troll that Blackbird has ever seen. Thank you. Cooper has, for the audience at home, has said hydrogen is fake, elements are fake, and molecules are fake, and so is chemistry. Shut up, nerd. And Cable eloquently has responded.
I never even liked
Cooper,
chemistry. Okay.
Yeah, I hate chemistry too. Do you think that if if we were 200 years ago, well, okay, it goes farther back than that. Let's say we're at the dawning of the Enlightenment, and you are trying to introduce scientific ideas to a group of people who see the world wholly as metaphysics. Do you think that you would be making metaphysical analogies to explain scientific reality?
I think most scientific reality doesn't really contradict a theological, metaphysical worldview. I think that is what the people who have tried to separate these things out have done to the broader conversation. I think that, I think, the earliest scientists were, many of them, members of the cloth in one form or another, right? And so I don't necessarily, I think you would maybe say, this is the way God actually put the universe together, and so we have to understand his mystery. Yes, you can put things in that sort of a language, but scientific discovery per se, I don't really think is the problem, I guess. And moreover, what we have now at the end of the Enlightenment, we might say, or at the as on the tail end of those days, is we have the understanding that you cannot feed a man on bread alone. You can't just give him this materialist interpretation of the universe, and this is the cold physical world, and blah 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 blah. You can't give him that and expect him to not ask for more. And so that's where we've seen this rise, what we call the woke, or whatever term we want to use to describe them. But this cult of diversion, the day cult, the Dei cult, right? With literally the DEI is a derivation of God, right? Diversity, inclusivity, and equity. Right? You could say die. That's what Jordan Peterson did to be clever. But really, but what's funny is they're using DEI in all the literature, which is it's literally this manifestation of a god, of a little g god in these people's minds. And certainly the way that they talk about it, it has become the moral fervor. What is that moral fervor? This is the fun part. It's actually the broader story. This is the thing that's connected for me recently. It is the rote memorization of the liberal project, which is to say there's somebody on the margin. We need to bring them into the center, and then we can become stronger for it, right? And so this is, again, I'm going to be a little normie for a second, right? So like black people were marginalized for generations in America, 100% historical accuracy. We're going to take those people at the margins of society. We're going to bring them to the center as best we can, and things are going to get better for it. Is the what was the idea, right? Italians and Irish, same sort of thing, right? Because it all has that same. It is that is the liberal ethic, is to take from the margin and center it. Take from the margin and center it. And then we had this, and then it's when we moved into the sexual revolution. And so, okay, we're going to take the gays and we're going to center them. And now we're reaching, and it's like, okay, we got the T's, and now we're getting the Q's, and things are we're kind of like we're losing the idea of a margin and a center, because it is literally inversion. Is the construct. So that is the ritual of the faith that they are participating in, and that's why people say diversity is our strength, and that has moral relevance for a number of people. But as the good book says, you can't build a good foundation on sand, right? And I think if you're always trying to take from the outside and bring to the inside, well, eventually there is no outside. So
yeah, there's and the people that get shoved to the outside, because you can't have everybody in the center, obviously. People who get shoved to the outside, they're not being recognized as, well, now we're marginalizing these people. And I'm speaking specifically about white men. And
but think about the introduction of the bell curve, right? Like, because even the bell curve is a reaction to what? It's a reaction to the sentiment that wherever there is a disparity in outcome, racial prejudice must be at the center of it. Mm-hmm. Why? Because racism is a method of social control that elites can exert on a population. So it's a lot easier to have people believe in racism than it is for them to. It's a lot better for people to believe in racism than it is for them to believe in a God that is all knowing and all powerful. We might say.
Matt, you were going to say something. Sorry, I talked over you.
That's okay. I was going to say that the There's actually David Patrick Harry, the Church of the Eternal Logos guy, talks about this in his NPC video. That instinct that we must draw everything from the margins to the center. This is actually there's some pretty deep philosophical roots to that thinking. It's actually it's like a Neoplatonic impulse where the irony here is that in the act of leaning into the diversity, they're actually striving for like an absolute unit, an absolute monad, where everybody, like, this is what egalitarianism is. Everyone must be pulled into one single level playing field. Everyone must be drawn to the center where there's one ideal individual. It's like this one ideal individual that's absolutely diverse, yet it's absolutely the exact same thing. Everyone has to be pulled to the same point. So it's the elimination of multiplicity in the pursuit of multiplicity that's actually like pulling toward this absolute unity.
I would differ. I don't want to get lost in a tangent, but I would differ slightly because, you know, Platonism relies on the perfect form of the thing, and what queerness is, the inherent idea of queerness is to remove the boundaries between things.
Mhm.
So it has
Right.
So yeah,
I think
Because
you
if
end
you-
up in the same spot regardless of,
Yes.
of how you look at it.
If you remove the boundaries between things, the elimination of all boundaries is the elimination of multiplicity, and you're left with unity. Because
Right.
there's no boundaries to differentiate, to distinguish between it.
Mhm.
And
I
this
was-
is the Christian observation is, or not, I mean, it's not observation, but the Christian response to this is that multiplicity and unity are not in tension with one another. They're not, it's not a dialectic. God is 3 and 1. God is 1 and 3. 1 equals 3, 3 equals 1. This is the root of reality, is the Trinity, which is both unity and multiplicity. And this is what this impulse is. I think it actually has deep demonic roots. That it's driving at the abolition of the. I'm running out of words here. The abolition of, because every word I want to use has like layers of loaded meanings that I have to try to feel like I have to try to unpack. It's the actual abolition of what is individual about an individual. Because individualism has this very loaded connotation of like the sovereign individual, the sovereign atomized, standalone human consciousness that doesn't actually exist. But we are individuals, and that there is something that's unique, and there's the you could say the spark of divinity that's unique in each of us, and that's being eliminated in the pursuit, ironically or paradoxically, of trying to make everybody unique, trying to recognize this infinite these infinite subsets
if
being
everybody
created.
is unique, then nobody's actually
Exactly.
unique.
Right.
But that's and we can reframe this in a very simple political construct, which is egalitarianism versus hierarchy. And hierarchy is the idea that everything has a place, and egalitarianism is that everybody's place is up for grabs. And so yeah, I think that's when you tell people that they can be anything, and they end up, you know, working a job that doesn't give them any sort of fulfillment. That's a shock to their, that's a shock to their ego. It's a shock to their identity. And like I pointed out as I intuited before, if you're actually going after the core of somebody's being, they're going to do everything they can to stay away from that. Right. That's why it's so difficult for people to, for alcoholics to admit they have a problem until they hit rock bottom, or so I understand it, is that you will do everything you can to push off the bad things that, your mistakes, and you'll do everything you can up to and including forgetting them at some point outright. You understand? So when the modern person is faced with that, again, they're going to do everything they can, including engage in a politics of resentment, right? Which is, a politics of resentment either against the elites, against a racial class, against a gender. It doesn't matter. They're going to do that because that's more important. That's a lot easier for them to. That's a lot easier for them to do that than it is for them to face themselves. And I think that feeds into the idea of the NPC, in that there are large segments of humans, and we can get into the degree to which that's heritable versus inculcated, but there's a large degree of humans for whom that's actually a better idea. And what the problem is the only people talking about it, perhaps we might say, aren't necessarily people who fit into that mode. So it's actually difficult. It's actually difficult for that idea to get out because, here's another analogy would be like, if you go to a college town, they're like the townies, and they're the people who like live in that town year round, and they're completely different from the college aged kids who go there, and so on and so forth. And then there are people who stay in the town that there's the people who go to New York City and make a go of it. And then there's the people who stay in their hometown and, and like have a family and do that. And all of those things are necessary. What the broader culture, the broader culture doesn't celebrate that anymore. Right. It doesn't even want you to celebrate the idea of a normal life. You have to have an absolutely superb, excellent life, or it's somebody else's fault that you're not having an absolutely superb, excellent life.
Right.
So we had mentioned or talked about history a little bit, and as an observation and maybe even a question for y'all, like when we're talking about this in this utopian type of society where everybody is unique but everybody is the same, all in like this one big gobbledygook mess that becomes this perfect unity of society, that completely ignores and flies in the face of all of human history. Like we have never as a species had any luck with that. Like people are very individualistic. So something that one of the novels that we had talked about in my little show this morning was Foundation, Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. And if you look at the Prelude to Foundation, it kind of establishes where the ideas of Foundation come from. And the ideas of Foundation, and the main protagonist, Harry Seldon, creates this like map of human history going forward, and like predicts everything that's going to happen for tens of thousands of years very accurately, because large groups of people behave in certain ways, and they become predictable. Individuals can throw that balance off, but large groups of people tend to behave in very herd-like manners. But when you look at the Prelude to Foundation, the way he kind of builds that up is he's looking at all of the different, very individualistic groups and the way they interact with each other into a larger thing. So when we're looking at like the way they're trying to structure society now, where instead of allowing these different groups to exist and interact with each other, they want them all to be one big giant group, and you're all the same. And there's no way. I don't know. There's no way that can work. How do we allow the social engineers to continue to push this obviously failing experiment forward, like with no real pushback, like y'all were talking about, like the people who are pushing back and having these kinds of conversations, we're definitely not in the majority.
No. Well, and I don't think it's necessarily that we're letting it happen. It's just that it's happening, like that we don't have the numbers. We're the I don't know, the establishment, the cathedral, the regime, whatever you want to call it. And granted, those are three different concepts, but you know what I'm saying. Like the manufacturers of culture
stand-in for the bad guy, as I was saying
Yeah,
in the most recent episode. Yeah,
the stand-in for the bad guy. That's sure. Whoever it is, I mean, they're making promises. We're not making promises. We're saying, hey, you have to have a low time preference in order to achieve this society that we want. And the other side are saying, hey, you can have everything you want immediately. We're going to lock in your house, but we're going to send you, $1,000 a month or whatever the stimulus check was. So, just stay home and stay safe, and we'll keep you safe and we'll keep you comfortable. That is not the promise that libertarians, right wingers, fascists like Matt are making. It's not even about belief for most people. Like, they don't have an ideology, I don't think. So it's not even about ideas.
This is part of the direction of where Kingpilled has been going.
Yeah.
Is recognizing that, number one, the majority of the people you don't even need to talk to. The majority of people will follow the people who lead. So the people I want to talk to are the people who are inclined to lead. And I want to encourage those people to lead, to start taking positions of leadership. And it doesn't mean that you have to immediately run for mayor. It means it can start on the micro level where you're taking leadership in this particular area. It starts micro and moves macro. The more you take leadership, the more you take ownership of a given area of your life, the more you get used to that, the more you adapt to that, the more you become wired to be someone who leads. And the more you induce other people to do the same thing, because humans are mimetic creatures. We naturally mimic the people that we see around us. So you can create a meme of people taking ownership, a meme of people becoming leaders. And then the natural phenomena of human society is that the leaders will naturally float to the top. They'll naturally wind up there whether they want to or not. And if your political philosophy requires you to try to convert the entire population to having the same, to thinking the same thoughts as you do,
Yeah.
then it's going to fail. But if you target the people who can lead and who will lead, and you induce them somehow into beginning that practice in their own lives, then you're creating, rather than shooting for a goal, you're optimizing a trajectory. And if you can optimize that trajectory, you can reach any goal eventually.
So this is kind of a subject change, but that was a good segue into it. There are 0 GOP Mises Caucus elected officials, and I know Andrew's not here to answer this question, and I would love to have invited everybody who I love and respect, like Andrew and Pete and Adam, Patrick, and everybody else, but I only had 4 spots. So anyway, there are 0 elected GOP Mises Caucus people. There are hundreds of elected Libertarian Party people. Granted, a good third of those are in completely immaterial town constable, sanitation director type positions. But there's a lot of libertarian, maybe not a lot, but there's a good sized number of libertarian city councilors. Why not target those people with the idea of an anti-tax, or of, hey, you believe people respond to incentives. Why don't you incentivize people to, in your position of power, incentivize people to be more aligned with the values that you claim to espouse?
I think I would say, first of all, just as a caveat, that I would let Andrew tell me I'm right or wrong on any of this. I would value his opinion on this over mine. But my opinion on it would be, first of all, if there were libertarians who wanted to, then I'm sure that
there's nothing stopping them.
Right. They could totally do that.
There is one thing stopping them. There is the attitude of Andrew and Pete and you guys towards libertarians. You guys are saying, no, fuck you, libertarians. We're going our own way. And not only that, but also like, we're going to make fun of you and talk about how much of a predator you are or whatever. I mean, it's not.
We all have our vices, okay?
I know. Well, yeah. I mean, I know. And on the other hand, if you go into any Mises Caucus group chat, I mean, y'all are a hot topic every day. What is the beef there? Why?
Let me put it simply. Nobody knows who I am anyway. Nobody was even fewer people were paying attention to me before I was an asshole about some of this stuff. Being an asshole is what gets clicks and is what drives the Twitter algorithm. So you can either, and so if you're going to complain about that, almost all of the quote unquote beef is has about the same nutritional value as spam. I mean, it's literally just a manufactured product that's a consequence of the internet stuff. There's not like there's been, to the extent there's, I mean, I don't know. If you come at people sideways, they're going to react in kind. That's the other part of it. It's good for those people. I want them to be the right kind of leaders in their community, whether they're part of the LP or the GOP. I just disagree that investing time in a third party is going to have the payoff that other people believe it does. And at this point, as they say, the die is cast, right? That means something in the world that I work in. The die is cast, and so we'll kind of see what happens over the next few years. Like I've made it clear, like I'm not somebody interested in running for politics where I live currently. Mm-hmm. It's not something that I have any sort of interest in. And so I'm going to keep doing my show and exploring ideas, because that is something that I'm interested in. And it's something I've always been interested in, before there was a before there were caucuses and takeovers and so on and so forth. So
No,
I think
not takeovers, resets.
yeah, because we have to because and listen, good rebrand, right? I mean, I'm not even denying the savvy of that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, do we want to, I mean, inflammatory conversations drive views on Twitter. That's the reality. And frankly, again, to the point is it's happened. It happened to me a couple of weeks ago where, I was like, okay, somebody's, what was it, Matt? It was that way. I hopped into the Twitter spaces. I'm going to release the interview here pretty soon. I'll release the interview because I have it recorded, but like, I don't even remember what the guy was taking exception to, but it was tied to the whole Dave Friend or Fed segment.
Yeah.
But it was to the point where it was just like kind of repeating the same thing over. And that's basically been the thing of like, well, why can't we do both? And it's like, okay, try it. I can get into the more complicated reasons that I have, namely that if libertarians are some sort of intellectual vanguard, then them cloistering themselves in a third party isn't going to be a good idea. I can talk about the fact that the party is already spending tens of thousands of dollars to get people on statewide ballots, which they're almost surely going to lose. I can talk, we can bring up the critiques, but at the end of the day, people have made their choices. To the extent that anything else is, it's like, I don't know, you can have disagreements with people. I think whenever somebody says, well, like, oh, those guys are rude, it's like, okay, well, you're not listening to me because I'm usually really nice. I try really hard to be nice. So screw you for not listening to me. But for two is honestly is like, okay, then I know you're reading the tweets and you're not listening to the podcasts, and you're not listening. You're not actually engaging with the ideas in the long form. It is the reality of it. Because the people who do are like, yeah, what is this disagreement stuff here? And for me, it's not personal. It's just they're just my observations.
And anybody who's asked about the disagreements and the stuff like that, like, has actually talked to me as a human being and had a conversation. When I explain what the nuance of the different types of strategies and what my opinions and beliefs are on the best way to go about enacting change and doing these things versus maybe what the Libertarian Party approach is, they're like, yeah, well, that makes sense. I'm like, yes, it does make sense. But, Twitter is a place for short form, taking jabs and throwing firebombs and trying to see what you can get to take off and go viral or whatever. So, yeah, like the people who actually are willing to have the conversations, they understand. But most of those people, they fall into, for as much as they're neither right nor left and hate the party politics, they really fall into the mentality of party politics and are only willing to see their way. It just so happens that their way isn't the right way or the left way.
I was on the Mises Caucus podcast recently, and he, the host Aaron did try to start that conversation with me, being that I kind of straddle the line, I guess, or at least I hope, in being friendly with both sort of factions in this. I was able to, I think, make a good case for, first of all, that the post-libertarians aren't one thing, but also that everyone who is called post-libertarian has really good points, and we ignore them and deride them to our detriment.
There's a couple of different principles of psychology that are at play here as well, especially group like mass psychology. The first one is we kind of touched on it already, that the majority of the people in question here are just not there. It's noise. Like, it's just not worth.
Well, can I butt in, because it's the thing of, again, like I said, I was somebody who was dyed in the wool libertarian thought for 10 plus years, right? Like, it's what I ate bread and it's like what I ate and slept. It's, when somebody thought, oh, what are we going to get LB for Christmas? It's like, oh, get him something libertarian themed. He'll like that. Like,
that taxation is theft.
That's why I have a taxation is theft pillow. And, it's like that. So, it's like, that was very much part of it. And then, but here's what happened. Here's what happened, at least from my perspective, is I started to listen to people who had different ideas. And I was like, oh, this has a point. And then you bring that back to the group, and the group's like, screw you, man. And it's like, but don't you know taxation is theft? And it's like, yeah, I got the pillow, dude. Like, it's like, no, we're pushing. There's actually more to see here in this conversation. And that's why I talk about that's why I've always tried to put it in terms of recalibration. But yeah, it does get annoying when you're kind of answering the same questions over and over again, and everybody thinks that they're going to have the freshest take. And by the way, I did that too. It's one of the pieces it's my open letter to popular liberty. That was, I wrote that to try and like talk about what I saw as some of the distinctions in the thought and ask for clarification.
LB started out as a critic of the people like this, and he wound up being the guy who literally wrote the frickin' letter on defining post-libertarianism that people still, for whatever reason, won't go read. They'll, what is post-libertarian? Here's what it means. Oh, I'm not going to read that. Okay, well, screw you. Like those are the types of people, like I said, that's the first psychological principle here, that those types of people are the vast majority of the people who want to weigh in on it aren't even worth, like, they're the same type of person. They're just someone who's had ideas implanted in their mind, and then they're going to go campaigning around the internet, repeating other people's ideas. And it's inevitable. That's what those people are going to exist. The other principle is, I referenced this earlier as well, is Girardian mimetic theory. That the most vigorous conflicts happen between people who are close to each other, not far away. Yeah. So libertarian infighting is going to be a lot more spicy than libertarians versus communists, which is actually kind of funny because I actually don't think libertarians and communists are that far apart anymore. But anyways, that's beside the point. I actually began this whole process as like the same type of, I don't have a taxation as theft pillow, but like that was my headspace. I saw myself as the most radical ANCAP, like as radical as you could get. I was like, there is no ANCAP policy that you could come up with that would be too radical for me.
Something I used to find annoying about you.
Well, see what happens. Like,
now it's different things I find annoying about you. It's
right, yeah.
Matt, I actually knew your wife, or knew of your wife before I knew of you, because she was Jason Stapleton's assistant. And I wasn't listening to Wealth, Power, and Influence where you were. So like when I emailed Jason Stapleton, I got an email back from Amy Rothbard. And I was like, holy shit, Amy Rothbard, who's that? Is she like related to Murray? That's so cool. Like, I mean, but that's how into it you guys were. Like,
right.
I mean,
it was a pseudonym. Yeah, it was the screen name. Yeah. That's what I was, Matt Rothbard on Twitter for a really long time, or on Facebook rather, for a really long time. Because that's how I saw myself that way. I was close to the LPMC when it started. I was very passionate about it. I was involved in a pretty intimate sense with it. And it was my desire to actually see anarcho-capitalist ideas implemented, to actually see them successful, that led me in the direction that I went. I was actually trying to figure out, how do we make these ideas work in more than just the theoretical sense? How can we actually port to a world where we can implement these kinds of things rather than just kind of theorizing about them? And I realized that the existing libertarian praxis was never going to do that. The way people were approaching, I just use the other buzzword, praxis, but the way people were approaching it, the way they were going about it, I was like, wait a second, this is never going to happen. And it came from studying marketing, working with Jason, and like understanding how you sell and market to people. And I was like, these ideas, it doesn't matter how good the idea is. It doesn't matter how good your product is. If your sales pitch sucks, it's not going to sell. Your product is only as good as the sales pitch, and you have to make sure that you have a market fit. And I realized the libertarian message didn't. So it wasn't that I was abandoning libertarian principles. It's that I was trying to actually make them applicable. I was trying to actually bring them into reality. And I began trying to share that message with people who I thought would be amenable to it. Because I was like, well, these are people who care about these principles too. So if I point out this flaw in the way we're going about this, like, I want to make it better. And all I got was just screamed at. And that was very enlightening. I realized, okay, I actually have less in common with these people than I thought. These people aren't actually serious about these ideas. They're just serious about identifying with them. That's all they want. They want to be part of a social club that identifies with the ideas. They don't want to actually see the ideas come to pass, even if they think they do. The way that they're behaving proves that they don't. And, a year later,
that's something that I've mentioned a few times.
Nobody likes an apostate. Sorry, Justin.
Right. Oh no, I would say that's something that I've mentioned a few times in the wake of the Hector Roos debate or whatever you want to call it, where it was me and Jim Magoo from Ignore the Rant, and we were having a conversation with Josh Havlicka and Hector about Hector running for governor in Florida, and I had mentioned like you could use this money to lobby and to get with the right lobby groups to get constitutional carry, to shoot down red flag laws, like all of the things that they were talking about that DeSantis is bad on. That there are ways to go about actually doing something to make progress on that without running a throwaway candidate for Florida governor. And when I suggested that, they said, well, if we did that, then the GOP is just going to take credit for doing that. It's like, okay, but you get constitutional carry. Does it matter who takes credit for it? Like, I don't give a shit who took credit for what got done here in Indiana. We now have constitutional carry. In fact, because we have constitutional carry, there's a very good chance that there was a mass shooter who was clipped in 15 seconds and, you know, prevented a much larger incident from happening. So, like, does it matter if the GOP takes credit for it and the libertarians don't get the credit? I don't understand why it would.
You asked me earlier if I identify as a libertarian and why I don't. That's why I don't, right there, because that is, I don't believe in like once a label is lost, you're not going to get it back. Like there's no like, oh, we're gonna convince people that that's actually not. No, if you're in that posture, you're done for. Just like I tried to fight the post-libertarian label for a while because I was like, I feel like I'm a libertarian who's trying to get even more serious about being a libertarian. I don't feel like I'm post-libertarian. I don't like this. But then I realized that's what people like. Every time someone would talk about post-libertarian, they're talking about me and the people in my milieu. Like they're talking about us. I know that I'm being referred to when someone says post-libertarian, so I might as well just respond to it.
And that's the biggest thing for me is that exactly what you just said. It's not that you're abandoning libertarianism. You're expanding it. And I don't know. I mean, maybe I mean, maybe the movement was so small when Rothbard was coming up with his ideas, but like, did he get accused of abandoning Mises when he became an anarcho-capitalist? And if so, like, so what? I mean, he was hugely influential. And if you're building on Hoppe's philosophy, which built on Rothbard's philosophy, which built on Mises's philosophy, on and on and on, back to the birth of the Enlightenment, which built on Christianity, then I mean, first of all, you seem to be kind of bringing that full circle. If I'm really being honest, but I mean, why so much hate? Is it really just that you're being a heretic? And if so, then it feels like maybe a lot of people need to do some soul searching, because we pride ourselves on being free thinkers and oh yeah, we're not dogmatic, but we are. I mean, you earlier you said libertarianism is well within the 3x5 card of allowable opinion. I mean, I don't disagree with you, but I have a feeling a lot of libertarians, including Tom Woods, unfortunately, would bristle at that. Speaking of heretics, Justin, you interviewed recently a guy who has kind of gone from libertarianism to the Tho Bishop, like paleo Republican camp, but he's using the Libertarian Party. Because was he like the chair of the Indiana Party or something like that previously?
No, I'm not aware that Brandon was the chair of the party at any point.
But he was involved, right?
Yes, he was a dues-paying member of the Indiana Libertarian Party, and in pursuing his political career, he left the Indiana Libertarian Party to join the GOP. So that's something that I've also talked to other people about. Is like, if it makes sense where you are to run as a libertarian and you can actually have success, then absolutely do it. But if it doesn't, like in Indiana, with it being such a deep red state, it makes more sense to run as a GOP candidate and use the infrastructure that exists and actually have a chance to be successful. Like if I were to run locally and I ran as a libertarian, even if I ran unopposed, nobody's going to know what a libertarian is. And people will even bristle at that just because they don't. Whereas if I run as a Republican, they know what a Republican is. And once they get to know me, they understand what I believe in, then, it goes a lot further to introduce them to those ideas. So that's what Brandon did or has done, is he utilized a strong Republican Party to put himself in a position to win. And not only that, but like if you go back and listen to that interview, like he did a lot more than that. Like he identified bad people who are bad actors in positions and was able to utilize that power and influence to remove people and make positive change towards liberty. Would he have been able to do that as a libertarian? Maybe, but on the level that we were talking about, especially going after like county tax assessors and stuff, which is an incredibly that's an incredibly cliquey position and very like, even though a lot of them are women, it's like very old boys clubby type of a thing. So to get somebody in that type of a position of power, effectively removed from office, and actually have at a state level laws be changed to prevent others from doing the things that person was doing. It's tough to do that from from the outside looking in as a third party. Like when you have existing infrastructure and you can push the right buttons to move in that direction, then why not use what's available to you?
Can I give an example of the way in which the signals get crossed between the various camps? And isn't it interesting that various cliques arrive in any come about in any subgroup, and there are people who travel between cliques, but those cliques still exist. It was going back to this mimetic idea, right? And I've put this in terms of humans take ideas and they run with them. So like, what was the meme for libertarian success for the last few years? Well, it was taking over the LP, right? That's like the big meme. And so then some of us have kind of come out and said, while you could take over, this is what I wrote in the post-libertarian moment to find, is you could take over the LP. It's just not worth it. It's not worth it as an institution, in my opinion. But then from that, you have to understand, if you want to get involved in politics, you should engage in the two-party system, and you got to work more likely with the GOP, blah blah blah, for reasons we can get into. And what's the response? Okay, you guys are going to take over the GOP, because that mimetic idea was already inserted in their minds that the only measure for success is takeover. Nobody ever said anything about taking over the GOP. That's a Sisyphean task if I've ever heard of one. Right? It's using the tools at your freaking disposal, man. It's a complete. This was something I always noticed about ANCAPs, is like that. If you think about your future house, the ANCAP knows how each room is laid out in detail, and because of that, he'll never find his future home, because it'll never be exactly as it looks in his head. I think that just describes a type of personality, and it's very difficult for those personalities to shift once they've set once they've sank their teeth into something, to mix metaphors. But anyway, I wanted to put out that mimetic takeover thing, because it's an important, it's a very non-controversial way of showing how the signals get crossed, and not drawing any sort of like personality differences into it.
That was a perfect way to demonstrate exactly what I was going to say. That the observation that Justin was making should be really like, it's not a controversial or like a dramatic thing to say. It's pretty obvious that like, use the tools at your disposal. And in most cases, given the reality of the political climate, the Libertarian Party is probably not going to be the best tool at your disposal for the majority of people in the majority of situations.
If you want to win an election.
Right. If you're wanting to win an election, which is what you use political parties for. Political parties exist to win elections. Political parties don't exist to run messaging campaigns. That's not the purpose of a political party. That's the purpose of a media organization, not a political party.
Well, like I talked to another candidate who is running as a libertarian. His name is Brian Piotr, running in Colorado. So I talked to him yesterday, and he's running as a libertarian, but the purpose for what he's doing, and after talking to him, like, it makes more sense. He's running in a heavy blue district with a squishy Republican candidate. So he actually has an opportunity to get endorsements and to make inroads with the Republicans in that district to kind of move things in the right direction. So going forward, you get the right candidates involved. Like, is he going to win? No. He's probably going to have a moderately successful campaign for a libertarian and get, say, 8 to 10% of the vote. And he's going to knock on doors, and he's going to like actually put ideas in Republicans' heads that, hey, y'all need to be better represented. Like, these people are squishy and suck. And you're never going to beat those people if you run people who are squishy and suck. So, like, that makes sense. And I wouldn't argue against him doing that because it serves a purpose. You know, in that case, it's not about winning. It's about you have to do something to move the needle. So, like, there are different applications of how you use this and how you manage your time and what you do with it in going for the ways that you manipulate power. And that's a weird word to use, but I mean, that's what you're doing is you have to be trying to manipulate power because that's what they do. That's what the left does better than anybody. They manipulate the power.
And you don't, to do what he's talking about there, you don't need a national level campaign. You don't need to have a party united in messaging. You don't need to go out with a radical anarcho-capitalist message. You don't need to yell at people to end the Fed. Like, none of that stuff is going to be productive. None of that is an appropriate use of resources. None of that's going to generate anything except for, this is the key part, none of that's going to generate anything except for good sentiment from the in-group. And that's what ultimately the majority of these people are looking at and judging according to. That's their metric is what's going to generate me the most cred with my in-group. What's going to be the most fun? What's going to make us feel the best? Rather than what's going to generate actual positive results. What's going to actually change the lives of anyone anywhere within the country. What's going to improve anybody's outcomes. Once you start judging based on that basis, it becomes like some of these observations, it sometimes feels silly to talk about them because they feel so obvious. They feel so like run-of-the-mill basic points. And you start talking about them and it's like you uncork a horde of banshees.
I think I differ, Matt, with your. I don't think necessarily that political parties exist to win elections. I don't know that that's like the objective telos of a political party. I think that I mean, like, for instance, Ron Paul didn't run for president, whether he was Republican or Libertarian, to win that election. I don't think he had any idea that he was going to win.
At least when he ran as a Republican, I think he did.
I don't know. I mean, well, LB, go ahead.
But Ron Paul running for president isn't the same thing as what the Republican Party exists to do.
Right.
That's the difference.
That's what I'm saying though. I don't think necessarily that necessarily running for an office that the ultimate goal of that, whether you're a party or an independent or in a primary that you don't intend to win or whatever, I don't think necessarily that the object is to win. I think that opening people's minds to other ideas might be just as, maybe even more noble pursuit for a politician or a political party.
I think you can I'm not the biggest sports guy, but I do know there's like Hall of Fame. And I know that like a lot of the people who get into the Hall of Fame also win championships. And yet there are brilliant players who are better than 90% of the world who never get into the Hall of Fame and who in turn never win a championship. So, which is to say, you know, you can judge things if you set that as your metric, then you know, you have a different metric of success. I just don't think that's the correct way of viewing things. But to the extent that that's what people are thinking, that we're just going to do messaging, then I guess it's no harm, no foul. And if you want to spend that money, you can, you know, you're willing. I can't stop you. But I view politics as saying it's about winning. And if you're not first, you're last, because we have a winner take all system. So
since you did mention sports, I will say that, you know, for anybody who's a football fan
I could have been a little cooler about that, but I decided to go that I know a little bit more than I let on.
Well, you know, for anybody who's a football fan or a baseball fan, you know, sometimes there are situations in baseball where you're going to bunt to move the runner forward, or in football you're going to run the ball not necessarily to pick up yardage, but to change your field position. So there is, you have to have some level of strategy with the political idea. Like,
and isn't this
like I was talking about
criticism?
Brian, like it's not, I guess but I guess at the end, it is still about winning, because when you do those things, you're setting yourself up for success at a later time. It's that, that low time preference thing. You have to, sometimes you take those minor losses. You're not necessarily looking for this to be the win, but I guess at the end of the day, it should be anyway, setting you up to win down the road.
Yeah, maybe all of these phenomena are because of the spirit of the age, or maybe it is a cause and effect type relationship. But Ron Paul and the Tea Party led directly to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is probably the most libertarian president that we're going to get in our, in this decade, let's say. And, if that's all we can get, then fine. But I would say that Donald Trump kicking Jeb Bush's ass is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that without these, fired up libertarian kids in 2008, getting the Ron Paul pill, I don't think that you would have had that result. Yeah.
And they need to stop being mad at dad, and they need to come back to the GOP. If I'm gonna play the, if I'm just gonna play to like the song, the tune that if I'm gonna like just jump into this tune that we're going out right now, yeah, the Ron Paul did have that effect on the Republican Party, and we thought that it was all lost with Trump. Turns out it's probably not. So let's not divert a bunch of this energy into an institution that won't be winning. Let's just say won't be winning any statewide elections over the next 4 years. I'll take a gentleman's bet on that if somebody wants to pony up. Nothing crazy, but I'll take a gentleman's bet on that by 2024 there won't be, I guess that's not 4 years. So in the next 2 years, by 2024 there won't be a statewide libertarian elected to office.
But there also won't be a statewide libertarian Republican elected.
No, but there might be an America First liberty-oriented Republican who's got a nerdy libertarian advisor, and that's a heck of a good deal to me.
You hope so.
While we're spitting out hypotheticals,
that's kind of the issue that I take, I guess, with Andrew's project. And again, he's not here, and I wish he was, but again, he's not. So anyway, you're still asking the general populace to vote for an ideologue and not for the guy who gets them the most fired up.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, if you're selling an anti-tax, or you're selling, let's give drug dealers financial incentives not to deal drugs on our streets or whatever, I mean, you still have to convince people to vote for that. And it seems as much of a fool's errand as, saying, hey, vote for this libertarian candidate for your city council race.
I think that you can kind of separate those between him talking about the types of things that the optimal local elected politician would do, and the types of things that they would actually campaign on. I think that the what they would campaign on would be optimized for the given location and the issues that are most relevant for that specific town or polity. But I mean, I'm someone who's on the record for having said that the Ron Paul revolution was a failure, and I did that in part to be provocative and to rile people up for the same reason that, like LB said, this is the way the game's played, and you're gonna rile people up, and the people who are actually open to hearing what you have to say are gonna be like, wait a second, how dare you say? Okay, what do you have to back that up? And they're gonna listen. And the people who would never have actually been interested in anything you have to say, they're just gonna get all pissed off and they're gonna yell at you, and you just have to kind of push through the static, and eventually they'll move on to something else to yell at, and you'll be left with the cream that rose to the top. Ultimately the biggest, I guess, critique is the critique that I had with the libertarian politics approach, and like what you said about running someone for kind of essentially a winning hearts and minds kind of project, is that there's multiple layers to it, but the I guess it might be distilled down to, okay, then what? So you're going to run people, you're going to run a candidate for
Yeah.
a winning hearts and minds kind of project. Okay, then what? This was my debate with I'll just say someone. I debated with someone on the Lines of Liberty podcast about this, an influential person within the LP. And this is my question. Okay, then what? Okay, we're going to get lots of libertarians elected. Okay, then what? And it was like that question was inappropriate. It was like, well, what do you mean then what? It's obvious. It's self-evident. What? Well, what? You're going to pass libertarian policies? What does
Because
that
when
look
you're
like?
stuck in the democratic frame, there is no then what.
Right.
Because it's about the game of inches.
Right.
And this is where that post-liberal recalibration, I think is it, again, I'm still in the process of doing a lot of it, but if I'm going to take my pundit hat off for a second, that says stop being mad at dad, go back to the GOP, and I put on my salesman hat, it would, and I'm trying to come in as a consultant, trying to say like, here's how you can improve your process. It's this, and this is precisely what I wrote in the post-libertarian moment defined. Or if I didn't write it explicitly, I've said it in subsequent interviews on shows like Lions of Liberty and with Pete Quinones and with King Pilled, with a bunch of people. I've said this multiple times is, okay, here's what and this is what I was saying when I was an active member in the LPMC as well, right? So my tune hasn't changed, right? It's just the audience that's just the empty room I'm playing to, as it were. But it's this. Focus on the mayors first, which is what I liked about Andrew's message, that every libertarian podcaster should be the mayor of their local town. And it says something about the time. And that forced me to look at myself and have a hard examination of what I was doing. Came out the other side fine, by the way. BeenAwake.com is a great place for you to go and subscribe for news, philosophy, and mindset. But here would be my pitch. This is what you need to focus on. Finding people who are going to run for office and people who are going to run people for office. And then the people who are going to donate to that and give their time. But your priority needs to be those two people, the candidates and the people. So to the extent that they're doing that, I view that as a good thing. But candidates and people for positions that aren't statewide, that you actually stand a chance of winning, which, by the way, is part of the calibration for the Mises GOP that makes it different from the LPMC, and where it's a different success metric in that regard. Because because the one thing I like about it as an outsider, because I'm not involved in any of the day-to-day workings of it, is that it seems to be that more personality driven. You got to find the right. It's perhaps somebody who was named earlier that's running against a very popular Republican governor in the state south of the Mason-Dixon, is running for the sake of his own ego. I'm sorry, right? Because precisely to the point of, well, we'd rather it be a libertarian win than the win come altogether. And that's what happens when you say here's 20 positions, who's going to run for them, instead of identifying your talent and utilizing your talent appropriately. I say this as the consultant, outsider, peanut gallery person that I am, but I don't think I'm wrong.
Yeah, I will say when Hector dropped in the Mises Caucus chat that he was going to run for governor after whatever heresy it was that DeSantis committed. And I don't remember what it was. I think it had something to do with guns, but
Which was passed in 1987.
He was supportive of red flag laws.
Wasn't it like no? It wasn't even that.
Well,
it was anyway.
Or maybe he wasn't. He wasn't opposed to red flag laws. Not necessarily.
He hasn't done anything about them yet.
Right,
That's the
right.
critique.
In any event, I think running against DeSantis, you have much more realistic fish to fry, maybe.
Yeah.
We have to go, but I do want to bring up.
No,
the
never
clear
end.
pill.
The eternal last.
I know.
Podcast.
Let's go for 5 hours. Fuck it.
At least 5 hours.
Matt Erickson, friend or fed. Let's go. No,
Everybody.
Totally a fed.
you're a statist.
I will cash any check you give me.
No, I want to get into real quick the clear pill that basically I think probably all of us agree that the liberal order is anti-fragile, as you guys put it in your recent conversation. And basically it's this: the more that we as libertarians, as right-wingers, as whatever, push against this liberal order, the stronger it gets, until probably its inevitable coming to an end in the same way that every, I mean, the word Byzantine is an adjective for a reason. I mean, these super overly complex technocracies, bureaucracies, etc., eventually fall under their own weight. So I don't really know what the question is, but the statement is this: we can either push back against it and it gets very, very strong and we suffer for it, but then it falls quicker, or we completely take a step back and encourage other people to take steps back until it becomes like irrelevant, and slowly grows and becomes more powerful, and we don't suffer as much, but the future generations do. I mean, what's the advice there? What do you guys think we should be doing and trying to persuade other people to do? Or am I asking the wrong question?
I think it's the right question. I think that's the most important question, because that's really like what should we do? That's what everyone wants to know. They're like, what should I do? And everyone has a call to action. Everyone has a pet project to send them toward. Mm-hmm. And this is really the fundamental disagreement, is that the LP, they're like, well, we want to funnel everybody into the LP project, and we're saying, for a variety of reasons, that's just a poor use of resources, a poor thing to dedicate your time and effort and energy to. And and I love this chat. And and really, so yeah, you referenced the conversation LB and I had where we talked about how the I gotta stop looking at the chat. We talked about how the regime is the term I like to use, which to me is not the same thing as the American federal government. The regime is a spiritual entity that includes the U.S. federal government, but it's really the enemy. It's the big bad guys that we're up against, and it is anti-fragile. It exists by inducing people to inject energy into the system and then responding to their resistance. That's what it sustains itself with. And when it collapses, and it's going to collapse eventually, it's going to collapse into something else, and that's going to be facilitated by apathy. It's not going to be because somebody overthrows it. It's going to be because it becomes so Byzantine, as you said. It hurts me to say, but it becomes so Byzantine that in the negative sense, that people are just going to check out of it. We're in the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it's accelerated because we have the internet. We're seeing what the collapse of the Soviet Union is like with the internet. And the Soviet Union, when it collapsed, it wasn't dramatic. I mean, it was a little dramatic, but it wasn't like, it just kind of fizzled out. And one day there was a Soviet Union, and basically the next day there wasn't, and then there was a decade of like the most prosperity ever. And that's how this is going to go. It's going to fizzle out. But what's going to cause that apathy? The thing that's going to cause that apathy is people seeing something better. And that something better has to exist for them to see it. So in order to get that something better there, people need to start building it. So this is where, people call them parallel societies or whatever you want to call it. And I don't think it has to be the same thing. I don't think there's a universal call to action here. I think for some people, it's going to make sense to run for office in their local town, like our good friend Buck Johnson, who's going to be running for office with the Mises GOP. It's actually, the name is changing. It's not going to be Mises GOP anymore. It's the Mises Mayor's PAC. And the goal is to sponsor people like Buck Johnson to run for office for their local town and start making a difference from that specific position. You can go to MisesGOP.com/king if you'd like to support us. And little plug. But for other people, they're not going to have the same mission. They don't have the same end goal. I think for the vast majority of people, what you need to be doing is making yourself not dependent upon the system.
Make yourself anti-fragile.
Yes, make yourself anti-fragile. You're going to be dependent on the system to some degree. You're not going to be able to extract yourself from it completely, because that's just how human societies work. But you can become less dependent on it. And that's going to look like, not like the supply chains going down isn't really going to change your day-to-day life all that much. So you have sources of food outside the system. You have sources of income outside the system. You have flexible financials in some way, where whether it's crypto or whether it's working under the table for people in your local neighborhood, whatever it is, you have some way of generating resources for yourself that are not dependent upon the system. And you just start creating little communities, little parallel societies, and those communities can network and just exist in the negative space of the regime, because the regime is not personal. Like, it's not coming after us, hunting us down. It's impersonal. It's a regime run by capitalists who want to induce everyone into being customers. They don't want to use force against you. So keep yourself out of the eye of Sauron, build a life that insulates you from the regime. And if you've accomplished all of that, if you've checked off all of those boxes and you're twiddling your thumbs looking for something else to do, now you're someone who should probably get involved in a political party in some sense, whether it's going to be you're the one running for office yourself, or you're going to fund someone else running for office. You know, you can either be a politician or you can buy a politician. Those are the ways that you can make a difference in politics. Otherwise, you should be putting yourself in a position to have the capacity to do one of those things.
Or you can make friends with the politicians and be the person whispering in his ear.
Sure, yeah,
which is my chosen path, if any of them are my chosen path. Actually, it's funny. Tyrion Lannister and Leo from The West Wing are my two favorite fictional characters in history, and I didn't realize it until fairly recently that they are like the brain behind the throne in both of those shows. And I'm sure that says something about me. And I'm not going to psychoanalyze myself because we've got to go. Like I said, so guys, first of all, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. I'm going to get emotional if I thank you too profusely, but you are some of my very favorite people in the entire world. And I really appreciate the contributions that you've made to my life, to this show, et cetera, et cetera. So why don't you all go ahead and give your plugs. Justin, you go first, because we're just going to go according to the squares on my screen.
Yeah, at jcamp1521 on Twitter, and you can find me at the Fact Check This Podcast on YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey, BitChute, all the podcatchers, and also look for me on The Morning After, which you cannot find by searching for The Morning After because there's 17 million videos on YouTube called The Morning After something or other. But if you search for Vasectomy Clubhouse, it will take you straight to our channel, and you should absolutely check that out because we have a lot of fun.
That should be the name of your show.
Wow.
So good.
Oh, shout out to Mark Metz too, who joined the chat. I hope you feel better soon. Speaking of The Morning After, he's on there, right?
Yeah, he's one of my co-hosts.
All right, good.
Who's next?
LB.
All right. So, well, if you're interested in anything that I've said here, you want to continue the conversation, please go to beenawake.com. That's going to take you right to my Substack. You can subscribe there. Have fun stuff in the works with that. Podcast should be coming back to a weekly release. Yeah. And, just closing out the point, I wanted to say we saw the recent example in Sri Lanka. I just covered this on my on my most recent episode, where everybody was super excited because they stormed the president's mansion. Well, if you didn't know, the guy who was just elected president was the same guy who wrote the World Economic Forum piece in 2015, who was the former prime minister. So just talking about the anti-fragility of the system, we have that example put very much in front of us. So if you're interested in exploring how we can recalibrate our perception to a post-liberal frame, I encourage you to come join me on the journey as we discover exactly that. Beenawake.com. Follow me on all social media at the LB Muniz.
And you can find me all things King Pilled. Look for me, Real King Pilled on Twitter, King Pilled on YouTube. If you go there, the most recent episode we put up, there was actually a live stream that your boy over here, LB, and I did together, where we talked about the regime and its anti-fragility, and we covered a lot of these different topics. There was a pretty interesting conversation, and then there's a whole bunch of others there, and there'll be a bunch more coming. So King Pilled on your podcatchers on YouTube and Real King Pilled on Twitter.
Great. Also, LB, I'm going to be in Chicago next month, and Matt, I'm going to be in Texas in October. Justin, I have absolutely no reason to go to Indiana, but if you want to come over to Chicago, head over. That'll be fun. So we'll have to see each other. Matt, I think you're the only one of these three that I've met in person. So
You met me.
God dang it, Justin! Every fucking time, I bring this up, I forget that you were there. I get you and Tommy and one other person mixed up in my brain. That's why I thought that I had you on the show before. So we'll again not psychoanalyze myself. Anyway, thank you guys for coming. Everybody, go subscribe to these guys' shows because you're going to be missing this one, and theirs is better anyway. So cool.
Thank you, man. It
this
was an
is-
honor.
This is
Yeah,
Blackbird
thank you for
100
having me.
signing off.
Enjoy your time.